All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on this lovely, kind of chilly Tuesday in Cincinnati, at least. Um, so we are covering Acumatica year-end closing today. Thank you all for joining. And we have with us our guest speaker, Tom Ferris with Martin and Associates. Um, and before we start, just a couple housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation, and you should get a link to this over the next few days. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat or Q&A feature in the Zoom meetings. We'll be I'll be monitoring that while Tom's doing the presentation. So ask away. And we'll probably answer those questions at the end of the demo unless it's quite pertinent to what's going on. And then I'll gladly interrupt Tom and shine the spotlight to see if we can answer that for you. Okay, we're going to be covering, generally speaking, closing periods in Acumatica, what that means, how to do it, 1099 processing, and printing forms and e-filing. As you guys may or may not be aware, the IRS has changed that again this year. Not necessarily the forms; those are pretty much the same, from my understanding, but the e-filing stuff. So. That's what we'll be covering today. Ask your questions in the chat again. And at this time, I'll hand it over to Tom.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Looking forward to visiting a number of processes in Acumatica for the outline and fielding your questions. Some of the questions, admittedly, you of course are welcome to email Chris or I or any other contact at Martin Associates. And if we don't cover it on this call, then we will gladly follow up with you. All right, I'm going to exit slide deck content and hop right into Acumatica. This we're looking at a demo database of Acumatica 2023 R2 release 2 that came out in October. So this might look a little different than current customer Acumatica instances, but we're starting at really the heart of period closure, the master financial calendar. Navigate there from finance workspace, and really this kind of gives you control over quite a bit. For starters, under our action menu list or ellipsis up here, kind of setting up your own checklist for year-end processes. There are a couple resources that Chris and I will reference during this hour that can give you like a starting checklist, but really each organization is unique. But certainly remembering to generate calendars for the subsequent period and or year, certainly. Once generated, those periods begin their life in an inactive state, so they'll need to be opened. At least say January 2024 period should be opened here shortly. Acumatica's period life cycle supports closing a period in both the subledgers and the general ledger. And then subsequently, and we'll talk about the difference between closed versus locked, the ability to lock a period, and then of course to reverse those that process. All right, so master financial calendar is kind of where a lot happens. In our sample data, we have 2024. If for some reason we were a year from now and I needed to generate an additional calendar, we'd be performing that activity. All right. The next bit of kind of like supporting configuration is a reminder the difference between a closed period in the general ledger and lock periods can be supported by a user role. So let's pop briefly into the user security workspace and take a look at an example user type which is like a bucket for folks to fit into a certain kind of broad role, and the user roles that are applied to those personnel. So we can see the list of the personnel that fit into that user type. What I really want to focus in on is on the financial supervisor role. And there's help content that explains on Acumatica, on help.acumatica.com, these predefined user roles. So ask Chris or I or someone else at Martin Associates if you're interested in a little bit more background on permissions. But the financial supervisor role, once granted to personnel, can allow entry into a closed period. So if we closed out subledgers for accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory, where applicable, cash banking, that's the CA. And if you have fixed assets in Acumatica, that's another additional subledger. Those could all be closed out so that there are no transactions, but journal entries against a closed period in the general ledger can be allowed prior to the period going from closed to locked. If you possess that financial supervisor user role and your general ledger preferences have enabled where'd it go? Where's their permission? Oh yeah, sorry, right there. It's the second one. Restrict access to closed periods. Right. So this is this can allow for certain persons to put in basically usually adjustment journal entries against a closed period prior to being locked. And again, once locked, it can be unlocked. All right, so that's a little bit on permissions. We'll close those. The master financial calendar can grant various workflows. One workflow is a more heavy-handed one for smaller organizations. I am going to close the sub-ledgers, accounts payable and accounts receivable, for example, right from here. And if I went here in my sample database and I started the workflow of closed periods, you'll see us move from master financial calendar to the action screen where work. And so let's do this. Let's get another copy of that open. So here's where I monitor status. Manage financial periods is where the action takes place. I wanted to close periods. And I could be, obviously my test data has lots of open periods all the way back to 2013. But as we select these, let's say I select a couple periods for closure and initiate process. It will remind me that right from here, I can close the subledgers simultaneously. In fact, these have to be closed, subledgers, prior to the general ledger, which is reflected here in the status, for it to toggle from open to closed. Right. So that's kind of a more heavy-handed process. Again, applicable for smaller organizations where periodic, subledger and period closure is not part of your workflow. Okay. All right, so we'll leave that behind and let's go visit a more common process for larger organizations where we have periodic closure per subledger. Let's go. We'll pick on, typical might be if we don't have fixed assets. I'll probably ignore that one for timeliness because its closure is pretty straightforward. If you have questions about fixed asset closure, please reach out to Chris or I. So let's go pick on our subset of customers who have manufacturing and or distribution heavy processes. It would be very normal to go to the inventory workspace and leverage this closed financial periods process. Let's let that come up here. And each of the other subledgers, banking, payables, and receivables will have the equivalent of subledger closure. So closed financial periods, when this, some prerequisites happen, the process will be looking for the presence of unreleased documents. That's going to be in this subledger, that's going to be inventory transfers, receipt, purchase receipts, issues, of inventory adjustments that were left in a draft state, sitting on hold or balanced. All of those have to go away, and Acumatica will remind you. And that same process would happen if we did the more heavy-handed closed subledgers simultaneously with general ledger closure. All right, so let's see if we can, I'm not sure we're going to today in our sample data encounter any, but you can see it preparing to show unreleased documents. Often we can get a preview of what those are and be informed that like your period closure is not going to be executed as you've toggled. We'll let that load later. But you can get a preface, sorry, of what documents you may have in a balanced or on hold state, for example, prior to processing. And then, typical processing will look like that. And now in the period, the fiscal year 2013, my sample data, the subset of rows that are eligible for closure has changed. If I wanted to perform a different process, like reopening, that'll be a different menu. Right? These are periods eligible for reopening. And again, in our master financial calendar, if I went all the way back to 2013, we will see a subset of subledgers for inventory. For example, you saw me close up through July 2013, and that'll be reflected here. Again, these are all prerequisites prior to a given period in the general ledger being eligible for closure and lock. Chris, any other highlights for closing subledgers?
No. Yeah, like Tom said, the easiest is, well, it really depends, I guess. If you need to close just a particular subledger and leave the GL open, then I would go to AP, AR, etc., close them there, and then just leave GL open in case you wanted to keep posting things. Yeah.
Right.
Let's see. That's common. And then, like Tom's saying, you gotta create and open at least January of, in this case, 2024, if it's not open already, so that you can transact in that period.
Yep. Excellent. The row I'm highlighting, or April 2020, 2013, is an example of one where purchase receipts, manufacturing material issuance, receiving finished goods from a completed production order, all of that will be halted in the April period, where transactions like receipts and issues and adjustments and kit assembly and inventory transfers would all be ineligible to be recorded in April 2013. But journal transactions are wide open. So that's going to be another part of procedure is closing subledgers. You don't have to close the GL period to put in journal transactions. A more restricted version of that is to close that period and then have one or more users with the very special privileges of the financial supervisor and still be able to put in journal entries to a closed period. That's typically for adjustment. Our sample data also has a configuration that is not required necessarily, but some folks find it useful to have. You can basically see redundantly the 31st of December possesses an adjustment period. Again, this construct is not necessary given Acumatica's security controls, but some organizations really like this structure. So if you have any questions about your period structure, let Chris and I know. It can be adjusted for subsequent financial years, but that needs to be rehearsed and practiced in a test tenant. I just didn't want this screen to suggest that this was required configuration. It's just an option because we can still put in adjustment-based entries to an open or even a closed period. All right, cool. That's kind of like the main content for um, period closure. Again, chasing down unreleased documents. I'll make a quick comment based on experience that say closure in the inventory subledger, unreleased documents and documents not posted to inventory for our customers who are on the call today with the manufacturing module. We'll sometimes encounter messages here that aren't terribly informative. Even in Acumatica 2023 R2, where a material issuance or a move transaction or a labor transaction that results in inventory movement or receipt, some of those documents in say a balanced or on hold state will not be totally clearly identified by the by the inventory subledger closure, because there's not a specific closure associated with manufacturing. But there sometimes the inventory closure process will be impeded by manufacturing transactions that haven't been closed out. The safest bet is, if you do encounter those errors, reach out to Martin Associates. And another option is to go right into the manufacturing production space. I don't have it enabled in this tenant. And simply go looking for transactions. There'll be material issuance and move and labor transactions. I'm pulling up a different transaction type for inventory controls. But basically, just go looking for documents that are in a on hold or balance state and make sure they're cleaned up and deleted appropriately. And that'll typically resolve manufacturing related impedance to closing inventory subledger period. All right. Moving on next to 1099 processing. Let's go through a couple basics. Begin with obviously defining vendors that have a 1099 flag on them. So if we go looking at a vendor record, actually, we'll just make that primary there. And so our 1099 vendor flag, let's go pick on some of our sample transaction or sample vendor records in our demo system, right? So is a 1099 vendor and then a box declared. That's kind of the first prerequisite. And there are customers sometimes at this time of year where we need to kind of retroactively assist them with 1099 processing. Hopefully everyone on this call has been monitoring this already, and this is really just about kind of wrapping up and reporting on. But if we do need to, Martin Associates team can help kind of rehearse bringing 1099 records or 1099 reporting up to speed, even retroactively, and kind of go through that. All right, so first prerequisite, 1099 vendor, and then which box by default. Next up would be the fact that a given bill or adjustment is eligible for editing without having to do a reversal. So I'm pulling up an example bill which has been paid to a vendor with the 1099 box, and kind of want to remind folks that on the details, even for a posted transaction, it's already generated batch, couldn't change much about the amounts without actually going through reversal, right? It's kind of standard subledger, AP subledger to general ledger compliance, right? So if we need to change any of the amounts for the bill or a detailed line that's associated with the 1099 box and its amount, that will require reversal. Okay. But if we did not successfully code the 1099 box line, this field remains editable. So yeah, even on a posted transaction. So we can retroactively code 1099 lines on AP bills to align with expected 1099 reporting. All right, quick run through on preparing those 1099 reports. There is a close process that will actually lock up the 1099 year completion. We typically start a 1099 year reporting and kind of closeout cycle with the 1099 year summary report, AP 654. We pick our year. This list of years will be, it'll basically react to payments made. So that's going to be checks or ACH disbursements or FedWire payments in the AP module that posted to that period. So again, it's going to be payment based, not based on the open payable liabilities. So this list will populate on its own. What this data list is telling us is that having done the 1099 year closure on some of the subsequent years in our sample data, no payment was made in 21 or 2022. That's what's jumping all the way to 2023. That's why it's doing that. This report, come on, demo system, wake up. There we go. Will give us a breakdown of the boxes. And let's see, Chris, you might help me out here that this form is still tuned to the MISC. Am I missing a configuration, or is this still relevant to a subset of folks?
It's still relevant to anything 1099.
Right. Outside of NEC designation.
Outside of the NEC, yeah.
Got it. Cool.
Well,
so go ahead.
I mean, NEC is still kind of included in the like box 7
right
type stuff on this particular form.
Yep.
Or is it box 10 now or 1?
I think it was always 7. Yeah, that sounds right. All right, that might be a follow-up from you and I for our audience. Okay. Next level of kind of summarizing the year would be to run the same at the detail level. This is beginning to prepare for 1099 MISC or NEC printout or e-filing. All right, so now we've got the details of and the way this report runs is it basically says per vendor, and each vendor will have its own section, and then lists the actual transactions and the detailed line elements that are contributing to that box or the 1099 NEC 01 total. Okay, so that's kind of next level of preview. Summary, details, and then up next would be either creating the forms for the printout stream for your mailing if you're handling that, or creating the e-file, a .txt file, which we'll demonstrate here in our demo system. Now is a good time to segue to a couple things, a couple updates from our friends at the IRS and also Acumatica's references. So let's pull this up here. All right, so the first would be an invitation for our Acumatica customers. If you are not familiar with community.acumatica.com, whole bunch of great resources there. And so we're drawing your attention to MISC and 1099 NEC updates for tax year 2023 per Chris's preface that our friends at the IRS, of course, are always changing things. the most important thing about some of the changes are ensuring that you are on the appropriate update. So this might be reaching out to Martin Associates, Chris or I, or other contacts there at Martin Associates, with confirming which version of Acumatica you're on to ensure that you are compliant with 2023 MISC and 1099 requirements from the IRS. This doesn't mean a major upgrade, doesn't mean you have to go through a sandbox and regression testing and all that. It was simply applying a small update patch to your Acumatica instance to make sure that we've got the right forms for printing. So that's kind of part one of this announcement. And the other is information for customers who submit e-file. So the IRS has changed the threshold. And let's see, why am I not seeing it? What the count is? Where's the declaration about quantity? Maybe Chris can follow up on why I'm not seeing the why we're bringing up the e-file. But basically, the IRS has declared that if you need to submit 10 or more forms, that it needs to be e-filed with them, right? That threshold used to be in the hundreds. They've dropped it down now to 10 or more. You should be e-filing with the IRS. Okay. And the other change we're going to bring up here briefly here is, there it is. Okay, so for some reason our Acumatica community record didn't actually declare it, but if you are following closely with e-filing and 1099, the IRS, they are declaring that 10 or more returns, e-filing is now required. Okay. So I'm going to go, and there might be some questions regarding that, so I'll have Chris monitor the Q&A and have me pause. What I'm going to do right now is, having prefaced summary level data, the 1099 year details report. My two workflows from here, depending on size, would be to actually run the print process for 1099 forms, according to the IRS, if I have 10 or fewer vendors, subcontractors, suppliers that are 1099, and run the 1099 NEC form. Again, I have our sales demo data at the appropriate version, right? So this is the first build of Acumatica 2023 R2, for example, that is compliant, right? So I'm at 23.203.04. Oh, that's listed in that Acumatica community. Again, if you have any confusion about what version of Acumatica you should be running to have the forms render properly, just let Chris and I or anyone else at Martin Associates know. All right, so there's my very simple print stream. It's just one pre-printed form with this little summary total at the bottom. Okay, the other way to prepare this is to create an e-file for the IRS. And so let's take a look at that process here. All right, it's 1099 year 2023. I am preparing NEC. Transmitter only versus all marked companies would be if you are an Acumatica customer who has carved up your business into multiple companies and or branches. So you want to pay attention to which organization externally you're referencing yourself as through the company and branch structure as the payer. Okay. and we prepare. It'll be on a kind of per vendor basis. Highly recommend generating a test file first. And when we hit process, the result is a text file, 1099, 1080C. I will typically take these files and rename them something a little less generic, that it's a test file, for example, and it's associated with me testing one particular vendor. I might even be uploading that to the Fire now Iris portal with the IRS as a test file. But certainly the generic name that Acumatica spits out, let me just go pull up my downloads file that it spat out. It's going to be very generic in name, right? It doesn't even declare the year, let alone who I am. That's actually all in the text file, right? So this is us, and then the vendor list begins, and see the presence of their address and EIN, etc. All right, so that's a very quick run through of both print form and to be compliant with 2023 requirements that the IRS came out with only months ago. You may need to apply a patch or an update to your Acumatica instance. Again, reach out to us at Martin Associates to accomplish that, to make sure we have the proper print forms, and then our e-file process. The last part of this is what we used to call it FIRE, F-I-R-E, and the IRS has a new platform called Iris for uploading. And this article does have an outline about how to actually e-file with them. It includes setting up or accomplishing this transmitter control code, TCC. And then you can actually have login credentials that we can generate. All right, Chris, any questions so far about 1099 generation, filing, updating Acumatica instance?
Not about that, no.
Okay.
There's the question like, what if I need to fix any invoices, like the vendor should have been 1099 and was not for some invoices, or should not
Excellent.
in 1099?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm glad to go back to that. The first step would be to successfully mark the vendor record in Acumatica as a 1099 vendor. And that can be done really at any point in time. That's a prerequisite to the next part of going and chasing down those bills, those AP bills that have been paid. And so long as the document amount and or the line level amount is correct, the 1099 box remains editable. If the amount is not correct, it doesn't do much good to change the 1099 box from, say, blank to something appropriate. Again, just to demonstrate this, I'll temporarily invalidate the 1099 box. You can see that that's editable. Nothing else about this is editable. Really, these are all grayed out because this is a posted and closed document. But it will allow saving. And in this case, I needed to add to the bill, say non-employee compensation, NEC01, and save. It could be as simple as that, assuming that the amount is correct. Okay. There's actually, I forgot to introduce this. On the accounts payable preferences, let's pull that up in an additional tab. If for some reason your print or reporting is not yielding expected results, do confirm the 1099 settings on the accounts payable preferences. Out of the box, Acumatica comes with some assumptions that if less than $600, for example, on non-employee compensation, then for the IRS's guidance, don't bother. And it won't generate any 1099 e-file data or 1099 NEC print stream, for example. So that's, if you wanted basically to change this, these are editable. But out of the box, Acumatica's Accounts Payable Preferences tab, Preferences form and the 1099 settings will have these minimum report amount fields. So if you have data that you have successfully coded for 1099, but it's not showing up in any of the reports or the e-file, it may be because you are below the threshold that the IRS has given guidance to publishers like Acumatica, and they've actually encoded that here, but it is editable. Chris, did setting the vendor 1099 flag and the editability of the 1099 box, do you think that answered the question, or is there more to it?
I believe that answered the question.
Okay, gotcha. This might not be applicable to current Acumatica customers, but unless they have gone through like maybe an M&A cycle and boarded another division, or maybe they're rolling a division that was on, say, QuickBooks into an existing Acumatica instance. When that happens, this process of adding the 1099 box retroactively to bills, or even creating a bill which does not post to the general ledger but represents all of the 1099 transactions to date at the cutover point, can be created. So that's another thing, is if, let's say in October of 2023, I had a division leave a QuickBooks instance and add them as additional company or branch or even tenant in Acumatica. And I've got my trial balances loaded and I'm ready to begin transacting from October 2023 to present and record transactions. But what do I do with the fact that I had 1099 transactions that I'm not converting into Acumatica? Well, you can actually put the accounts payable module into migration mode, have an AP bill that represents all activity from January 1, 2023 to, say, October 31, 2023. Does not post to the GL, but reflects the 1099 box amount as a catch-up to teach Acumatica about the 1099 value to date. So that is a cutover or data conversion technique that Chris or I or anyone else at Martin Associates could walk you through if you do have mid-year and you want to play catch-up. And to the parties asking the question early, maybe all the transactions are in here, and maybe it's difficult to apply the 1099 box retroactively to all those transactions. You have at least two options. One, Chris or I or someone else at Martin Associates could sign an import scenario. You tell us who the vendor is. We'll go find all the bills and these detail lines, and we will add this 1099 box field value and mass to all those transactions. So you can always design an import scenario. In other words, that the edits that I can conduct like this right here in the user interface can be accomplished by an import scenario and mass for you based on an Excel list, for example. So that's one option. The other option I mentioned is to temporarily put the module into migration mode, build a fictional bill that appears paid, that also doesn't post to the GL, but represents the cumulative amount. Now, of course, you won't have the detail level, but we could put in a transaction that represents the 1099 balance to date on a non-posting transaction. So a couple different options. All right. Cool. Any other questions, Chris?
Let's see. I think you've covered a lot of them. Closing year. There's one just about, again, verifying that, oh, can I close 2023 and then still enter adjusting entries? I know you covered that at the beginning, but
Yeah, but let's go. Yeah, let's go
yeah.
back. Totally. Let's leave that. I'll leave those up here. So back to our master financial calendar. For there's really kind of two scenarios potentially within that. Scenario one would be all subsidiary ledgers are closed per our, say, March 2013 row. And I've also closed the general ledger for that period. If I possess the correct security permissions, namely the financial supervisor user role, and the general ledger preferences form is set to restrict access to closed periods, then I can actually create journal entries against a closed but not locked period. I guess another scenario within that would be if I've already locked the period, I can unlock it and bring it to a closed state, in that which case I would not be able to put in and conduct, say, like run an allocation, but I could at least put an adjusting journal transaction in. The other scenario would be similar to, say, the April row here, in that no one can put in any inventory transactions, but in the general ledger, the period remains open. And that's just another type of workflow that will just really depend on how many users have access to the journal transaction form. If you are not concerned about how many folks have access to the journal transactions form, you could basically close out accounts receivable, accounts payable, just like we've closed out inventory in that period, and then enter a journal transaction. It will only be to the GL module that represents the adjustments you want to make. There are a couple different ways to do it. For each business, the pros and cons are going to be different. So I would recommend maybe spending 15 or 30 minutes with someone like Chris or I, or someone else at Martin Associates, to ask about your specific scenario. Okay. Right, Chris, if there's any other questions, let me know. I'm going to go and just kind of meanwhile demonstrate all that's available out there at help.acumatica.com. Put it in a string like period closure.
Yeah, they do.
Spelled correctly here. How about year end? There we go. All right, so fairly open-ended search capability at help.acumatica.com. For some customers who are asking about, oh, what should my checklist be? The answer is it's going to be unique to you. On this call, we went over some of the variables that might change your year-end process. But if you are looking for some general guidance, again, help.acumatica.com isn't a bad place to start. It will come up with some examples and considerations for, well, you might probably need to generate, like Chris mentioned, subsequent calendar year and periods and open them so that no one's complaining on January 2nd that they can't post transactions. The financial period kind of closing out in subledgers, which we talked about. Right. So even just observing the year-to-date net income and retained earning accounts posts that occur on fiscal year close really opening or even unlocking as necessary. So this can be a decent place, Acumatica, help.acumatica.com, to come up with a starting list, which you will invariably probably modify for your own particular needs. And again, working with us at Martin Associates, we can come up with like a more tailored checklist for your fiscal year end closure and 1099 processing. Okay. Chris, if there weren't any other questions, I'm at the tail end of the content that I was hoping to present.
So far, we're good.
Okay. What I'll probably do is say thank you to everyone for your time. Chris and I look forward to any questions we might have generated. Chris, I'll let you close us out.
All right, perfect. Thanks everyone for joining, as Tom said, and ask away with questions. Reach out to myself or anyone at Martin and Associates, and we'll be ready to help out. Other than that, have a great Tuesday.